My name's Antonia. My daughter Isobel was diagnosed with SJIA in June of 2019. She was nearly 11. She didn't present with any joint involvement, so I know that made it difficult for our local hospital to diagnose her. She was a bit of a mystery. So after 2 months of talking about various viruses and Kawasaki disease and leukemia, they tested her ferritin, which came back at 35,000. Her CRP was 120 and her ALT was 94. She went for a bone marrow biopsy, which I don't really understand how it works, but she was then immediately put on a pulse of IV steroids and put in a high dependency unit. She was then transferred to Bristol Children's Hospital, and she spent 2 weeks there on a high dose of steroid pulse. She left there after 2 weeks, and on returning home, she went back to school. She became very steroidal. Cushing's syndrome was really strong. She lost her hair, and that was obviously quite distressing. We then put her on a weaning dose of steroids because we were hoping that it would be a one-off episode, but by August her ALT levels were creeping up again. She was incredibly itchy, and I know you've just touched on that, Rashmi, but and when I say itchy, she was suicidal with the itch, with the rash. It was all over her body. It was absolutely terrible. She was then put on to tocilizumab. She had a fortnightly pulse of that, and then we went on to weekly injections. It just didn't work. She was well, but not well. It was sort of keeping her in a state of survival, I suppose, but that was about all. So 13 months after her original diagnosis, we moved her to anakinra. We were told that it was going to be her wonder drug, and so we were excited about that. It was not her wonder drug. She started really well on it, and we were quite hopeful, but then COVID happened. She contracted COVID, but she was already becoming more and more poorly, but then the regular blood tests didn't happen. Because we weren't able to go into hospital. So with COVID, we did a lot of Zoom calls to make sure that her breathing was okay. She did the walk test, can you run up and down stairs, that sort of thing. And we then went back into hospital in the December because her ALT levels had risen again, and she was unwell. So she had 2 rounds of IVIG. And we went back into hospital for 4 days. She was given a 3-day pulse of steroids, and we were sent home. It was very frustrating. My husband and I felt that steroids were just being used to sort of mask what was happening. We weren't really getting to the bottom of anything. Over the course of December, she became increasingly unwell. She went completely yellow. She became extremely breathless. And over Christmas, she was just incredibly poorly. Her doctor in our local hospital called me on the 27th of December and asked me to get a second opinion for her, and which I agreed to. And the doctor in Devon contacted Professor Ramanam, who I know you all know. He had seen her a couple of times over the course of her previous diagnosis, but wasn't her doctor. He looked over her files and agreed to take her on. She was admitted to hospital on the 29th of December. Her ALT was 1,783. Her ferritin was 430 and her CRP was 2. So we went back to Bristol. And when she was hooked up to all of the observation machines, it became apparent that her oxygen saturates were very low. It was 87%. Everybody was quite surprised that she wasn't blue, that her lips were a normal colour, but I think this had obviously been happening gradually, so her body had sort of got used to it. We were then told that the anakinra was basically poisoning her liver, and after much testing had probably caused ILD as well. So she was immediately weaned from anakinra, put on high dose of steroids again. She had 2 blood transfusions, and then Prof. Ram did the high-cost drug referral for baricitinib, which she started as soon as she possibly could. After 4 weeks in hospital, Isobel was discharged with oxygen permanently at home. We were told that the likelihood was that she would need oxygen permanently. Fast forward 3 months, her oxygen levels were increasing. She could come off oxygen during the day, which meant she could go back to school as the country began to open up post-COVID. And on the 5th of August, so we left Bristol on the 29th of January, and on the 5th of August, we went back to Bristol and met with the pulmonary team and Professor Ramanam, and she was told that she could come off oxygen permanently, that her oxygen saturates were back up to normal levels. Sorry. In the 4 years since that happened, she's living a normal life. She's passed all of her high school exams. She's a cracking kid. She's extremely funny, very naughty. Keeps us all on our toes. There are side effects. So she's 16. She's only grown to 140 centimetres, so she's extremely small. She does still suffer with rashes. So during her menstrual cycle, a rash will appear. But it's manageable. She has the occasional flare if she has contracted a virus or anything like that. But generally, she's a happy, healthy, very petite little person. So, yeah. Thank you.
Hi. So, for us, like many others, Miles' SJIA journey began with a rash. So 2 weeks after his second COVID infection, he developed a spotted rash across his hands, face, and legs. And over the next month, doctors from our large pediatric hospital diagnosed with hand, foot, mouth, hives, eczema, even pinworms due to itching. He started to complain about his feet being sore every evening, and we soon realized he had a fever. Then he also suffered from immense joint pain to the point where he was able to walk or hold a pencil. They came like clockwork, gone in the morning, and repeated every night, never missing a day. Our pediatric hospital called him a medical mystery after urgent care visit, night in ER, and multiple follow-ups. In desperation, we emailed our old pediatrician across the state and shared all the reports we had, and she instructed us to fly Miles to another pediatric hospital, which we promptly booked a flight and was on the way in an hour. We were admitted immediately at the second pediatric ER, where they reran the labs, confirmed similar results. While the hospital, we received a call from the first hospital saying that they believed that Miles needed to be checked for Kawasaki disease, and we said that we were already inpatient. He was arthritic in his fingers, ankles, knees, with joint effusion in both knees. His ID panel was unremarkable except for the rhinovirus, and after 3 days, they finally discharged him with SJIA and naproxen. And I think some of his labs are shown above for when he was diagnosed. Despite some relief in the joint pain, the fevers broke through the naproxen every night, and the rashes continued to increase. I asked about the biologics, but then the rheumatologist told us to wait longer to see that the naproxen would work, but his labs kept on increasing, and his inflammation markers continued to get worse. So we insisted again. I mean, the ferritin went past 600, which is, he's still kind of at the early phase, but it's obviously that it was increasing very rapidly. We insisted on biologics again, and then they were able to test for the HLA markers, and his HLA-DRB 115 came back negative. But despite multiple tests, the TB test kept coming back indeterminate, which delayed us a little bit further. But then we pushed forward, and then he was able to get anakinra, and his symptoms started to improve within 24 hours. After about 1.5 weeks, his labs also significantly improved. So we asked to test Miles' L18s, actually, citing the research that we had read. But my request was denied multiple times. Even in 2 different separate appointments, I insisted I could pay out of pocket. The reasons for denial included that it was just too difficult to test, as they would have to be sent to Cincinnati. The rheumatologist also suspected that his results would just be completely normal because he was not an MAS, and they would only run it if he was an MAS. But I wondered, isn't that a little bit too late? Don't we want to the goal is hopefully to track the patient, monitor and treat the patient before they get to that point. At that point, we'd been living away from home for a while, so we decided to move near a hospital that was best equipped to take care of all our children, as we have a second child with special medical needs. Despite Cincinnati being across the country from us, we decided to move there, and I secured their earliest appointment with the rheumatologist. At Cincinnati, our new rheumatologist noted that he would like to test for the IL-18s and immediately ordered the labs before we could even ask about it. He noted that the IL-18s would take a while to drop, so we should still see that it's elevated. By the time that Miles did have his IL-18s tested, he was already well controlled on anakinra. His labs had been normal. His ferritin was at a healthy 95. ESR was 5. And the CRP was less than 0.3. So but the only thing was that his eosinophils were starting to increase at 13%, 1,200, and the IL-18s did come back at 30,000, which confirmed our suspicions that it would have been much higher while he was on his big flare. Rheumatologists watched the labs, and we almost switched to Alaris because the eosinophils kept on going up, went up to 18% at 1,500, due to research that we saw indicating that the highest eosinophils were associated with more complex SJIA phenotypes and also lung disease. Miles had large, days-long welts at every injection site, and he was developing red patches on his cheeks, which made us worried about the possibility of DRESS. However, he didn't seem to have any other symptoms, so we started Zyrtec to help with the site reaction. We continued to monitor closely. We measured the IL-18s, and then it was actually at 18,000 only a month after the first measurement, and that really showed us that anakinra was treating the disease both internally and clinically. The eosinophils finally decreased a bit, but then Miles erupted into an explosion of itchy, ratchet patches all over his entire body, severe peeling and cracking, diagnosed as probably eczema. He ended up on topical steroids for the rest of the year, including having to switch to stronger steroids multiple times. But it was the first time that he's ever had severe skin issues, but with his IL-18s continue to decrease on medicated SJIA remission, with the anakinra, we actually decided to stay on the course of treatment accompanied by the topical steroids. He also had a pulmonary consultation, and his chest CT did show that it was normal. So his skin issues did resolve earlier this year and has not returned since. He's had another rise in eosinophils earlier this year and a third bout of COVID that resulted in a temporary return of joint pain and stiffness in both ankles for multiple days, as well as a return of the red patches on his cheek, but it subsided as he recovered from the viral infection. Today, he's actually no longer suffering from any skin issues and has continued to achieve medicated remission. His IL-18s are now down to 2,000, as just measured a few weeks ago.
Hi. Hi, I'm Amy Pennington. We've got a daughter, Emme. She's 16 and diagnosed whenever she was 4 back in 2012. At the time, we were living in Atlanta, Georgia, and Dr. Stevens she was under the care of Dr. Stevens. At the time of her diagnosis, she was presented with fever, rash, arthritis in her ankles, knees, wrists, and elbows. Fortunately, Dr. Stevens started a really aggressive treatment with her. We went on to biologics really within a month of her diagnosis. And we really couldn't find the right, combination for Emme. She was on steroids from the get-go, was on steroids for the first 6.5 years, and we cycled through many, many biologics from Kineret to Actemra, Humira, Xeljanz, Ilaris, and she had her first bout with MAS in 2017. And at that point in time, the plan of care became Orencia and Ilaris because Emme had many systemic flares throughout her and continues to have them throughout her journey, but she also has a lot of arthritis in her joints as well. So once we got on the treatment of Orencia and Ilaris, we were gradually able to wean her off steroids after being on them for 6.5 years, and we just managed her joint pain with pulses and joint injections in hopes of keeping her off of oral steroids since she was it was very challenging to get her off of them. In this time period, though, Emme was diagnosed also with AMPS and psoriasis. The psoriasis became more present after she came off of the steroids because that had been managing that. In late 2021, we transferred our care to Cincy once we moved back home. And that was the first time that Emme had her IL-18 and her CXCL9 tested. As early as, I guess, whenever we moved back, her IL-18 was in the upper 10,000s, and as it continues to climb, as recently as she had MAS in July of 24, it is, at the last time we tested it, was 167,000, as you can see, and then her CXCL9 also continues to climb, with MAS and the systemic flares that she has. Since moving back from Indiana, or to Indiana, Emme's also developed Hashimoto's disease and other GI issues such as EOE and a chronic pyloric ulcer, which we have been able to get that ulcer under control, but it has developed a left scar tissue there that she deals with complications from that on an ongoing basis. Orencia and Ilaris have stopped working for her, and since then she's had numerous systemic flares that's required hospitalization, and some have come along with more bouts of MAS. Her most recent bout with MAS was in July of 24, and it had attacked her liver at that time. And she started back in July of 23 becoming steroid dependent again because she had a bad systemic flare that landed her in the hospital in July of 23, then again in December 23, March of 24, and then back July of 24. So her systemic and her arthritis issues keep growing. Since July of 23, she's back to being steroid dependent. She is still on the combination of Ilaris and Orencia. We have tried going back to Xeljanz. We've tried Jakafi, and we're back to Orencia. And then she's on oral steroids, and we're also supplementing with pulse steroids. So today, basically where we're at, we've been waiting for her to get on MS-825. We first had those conversations or learned of that back in July of 23, and then as she progressed since then, we really started moving in the spring of 24, trying to get her on that medication. We're hopeful that next month she will get on that. In the meantime, we have consulted with BMT team at Cincy, and they are open to a BMT. However, they do want to have her try MS-825 before all of that. So, but as I'm sitting here trying to, pack 12 years of a journey into a very short amount of time and feeling like I've got my 16-year-old daughter sitting here on my shoulder, wanting to make sure I am advocating for her as much as I can and not minimizing her journey. If it was up to her, she's processed a lot. Has a very strong voice and, on her journey, and a BMT is where her heart and her head is. She became very hopeful after meeting with that team, and her concern is with MS-825. She's been on this journey long enough to know that these drugs are only going to last her for a certain period of time if they work at all. And so her mind is what's going to happen after, if MS-825 works for her, how long is it going to work? And once it stops working, where do we go from there?
Natasja, and I just want to say I'm sorry we don't have time for your asking clarifying or other questions of the parents, but please find them and talk to them. They're here because they're trying to figure out some of what comes next, and we'd love that. Onwards to Natasja.
Okay. Taking the picture. Okay. This is Reza, a joyful, sporty, selfless and confident girl. She had a life like others until she was 11 years old and played sport 5 days a week. Her health problems began with rash, joint pain, fever, muscle aches, and fatigue. Worsening symptoms eventually led to a referral to the Children's Hospital in Utrecht, where she was hospitalized, diagnosed with SJIA, and started with Anna Kindra in 2015. She had an initial good response, but unfortunately, she did not get into the long-standing inactive disease. Over the years, Over the years, through ups and downs, various medication, Anna Kindra, tocilizumab, canakinumab, and more were tried, but her condition remained challenging, with IL-18 levels consistently elevated above 10,000, even when there was no observable disease activity. She remained focused on sports and study, holding on to trust in her journey. Next slide, please. In 2020, Reza endured 3 episodes of MAS. The first 2 were smoldering, with symptoms like fever, headaches, severe fatigue, and confusion. Weekly hospital appointments felt unpredictable, with fluctuating lab results and no clear pattern between symptoms and values. Changing prednisolone doses added confusion, making it hard to gauge progress. At times, she wished clarity for her persistent condition, even if it meant worsening symptoms rather than enduring constant uncertainty. The 3rd episode came fast. She quickly became very ill, requiring hospitalization and treatment with methylprednisolone. IL-18 was over 220,000, and it seriously impacted her physical and mental health with significant social impact due to isolation. And the week after, she was diagnosed with derealization. Next slide, please. Then, despite everything, she remained positive, yet loneliness weighed on her, transforming her from a confident child into an insecure teenager, bravely battling anxiety. The uncertainty, inconsistency, and isolation strained her both physically and emotionally. Yet focusing on her dream to become a pediatrician, to support other children, and her faith in recovery kept her going. For nearly 2 years, she worked tirelessly to rebuild her strength with one main goal: to play field hockey again, even if just for a few minutes. In September 2022, she succeeded in joining her team once more. After months of new fake symptoms, low iron, abdominal pain, vomiting, and severe fatigue, she faced yet another diagnosis. What she initially thought was SJIA disease activity, part of her MAS recovery or mental impact, turned out to be Crohn's disease in October. This led to months of tube feeding and eventually surgery in December to clear her intestinal blockage. 2 weeks after her surgery, just prior to New Year's Eve, we had to rush to the hospital. She began experiencing severe pain attacks and was immediately admitted to the ER high care unit, where she was treated with morphine to manage the pain. The doctors rushed through all likely causes and decided it was another episode of MAS, potentially triggered by bacteremia related to the surgery. And while the year crossed into 2023, she was hooked up to a vital monitor on antibiotics and started the first series of many IV steroids while sleeping. Oh, sorry. A rare bacterium was found and antibiotics adjusted accordingly. She improved initially, but then developed a fever again. We rushed into a series of echocardiograms and CT scans. It seems that MES had reappeared and flared again. In addition to methylprednisolone, they introduced cyclosporine. Her conditioning wasn't stabilizing, as in the Netherlands we don't have direct access to Gamifant, only under clinical trial condition. We signed consent for the trial and we had to wait the trial screening period, since evidence was required that conventional treatment were insufficient for at least 3 days. While we were waiting for the Gamifant, our case started going out of control, with ferritin levels exceeding 345,000, an IL-18 level above 170,000. She suddenly developed liver failure, respiratory issues, and ultimately sepsis, and she was admitted to the ICU. Treating the sepsis and MES required multiple intervention. Due to her liver failure, she had to endure all of this without any sufficient pain medication or anxiety relief, as her condition continued to worsen. The doctor pulled his parents aside, warning that they need to induce her and she might not wake up. Refusing to give up hope, in the middle of the night, I called her rheumatologist, who was already on his way. Through tears, I asked if he could start Gamifant immediately, a drug that has shown promise in clinical trials. Within 1 hour, they began the treatment. And the moment her brother Stijn walked into the room is an image that will never fade in his memory. And her first response was, "Mom, Stijn should not be so worried. I will be fine. Could you please tell him that?" After starting Gamifant, it immediately showed effect. Her MAS started getting better, but her situation was still very unstable. Every other day, she was given Gamifant infusions. But other complications got worse. She had developed renal insufficiency and needed dialysis, and her surgical wound didn't heal, which repetitively led to internal bleeding. Multiple blood transfusions were needed, and she was placed in an induced coma, and a temporary ostomy had to be created. After 5 days, they brought her out of the coma, and despite the anxiety, the outlook began to improve slightly. It was in one of those moments in the night that I thought Reza was asleep, as I dozed beside her, and she suddenly called out, "Mommy," and I responded, assuring her I would never leave her side. She hesitated, and as I held her hand, she said, "You know how deeply I love you, right?" And after I reassured her, she continued, "But Mom, I'm also thinking about Dad." The silence that followed was overwhelming, a moment when hope was gone and trust seems to vanish. My vision went black, but in the same instant I pulled myself together, knowing I had to stay strong and keep faith for her. She was discharged from the ICU, transferred to the Children's Hospital so a rheumatologist could closely monitor her. She slowly starts to recover and is still showing an enormous strength, incredible. But then her conditioning suddenly worsened, and when she developed another fever, we are back at the ICU. It was the return of MAS. On Saturday noon, just prior to a challenging intubation, Reza and I shared an intense conversation. I told her how much I loved her, how proud we were, and she reminded me of life's small things worth fighting for: breakfast, swimming, and cuddles with her brother. I held her hand for hours, expressing my love and gratitude for being her mother. Late Sunday afternoon, the doctors informed us that there was no hope left, and we had to take the decision to say goodbye. And her final words from the day before, "I love you so much, Mommy," were the last she ever said to me. She took 2 more breaths and passed away in my arms. I come to a closure. Reza showed us love, kindness and courage, but I wouldn't do her fight justice if I didn't continue to fight for other children with SJIA. The story of Reza was impacted by all of you. You gave us extra time and hope. Thank you. It helped her and us to know that through Dr. Foster, she had access to the latest knowledge on SJIA treatment and this community. Bas, you know we are forever grateful. You meant the world to her and us. Rashmi, thank you for all what you have done and achieved so far, for giving us the opportunity to be here. And I believe by working together, sharing our own experience, knowledge, data, learnings, funding, and being open about successes and areas for improvement, we will be able to find a cure. And let me end with a question. What prevents us, maybe next slide, what prevents us from recognizing the independence in contributing to a better quality of life for these children? Also, what stops us from having the meds for helping kids like Reza? And how can we work together to make that happen? And how can I help with that?
Thank you so much, Natasja. I met Reza, about 2 years ago, when Bas told me a patient of his was going to be giving a talk at ULR, and that if I could help her prepare her talk. She was just like this bright spirit. And with Natasja's help and other European parents, and we've really tried to have more European parents here, we want to start working more with the SJIA Foundation in Europe. And we have a meeting for that later today. So I hope you all help us start working there and helping patients as we can and being the patient arm. And we are willing to do what it takes to make that happen with Natasja's help. So thank you so much, Natasja. I think Reza's brother Stin is also here somewhere in the room. And, oh, there he is. And thank you all for being here.